I'm happy to answer any questions you might have or, oh, lovely. Thank you. Joy of working at home with cats is they spill your coffee all over you, so that's fun.
No, not the kid. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. I might ask for a quick second to go change my shirt.
Yeah, take your time.
Yes. So in that glorious segue, I'm going to give you all a second to maybe chat with each other and post some questions in the chat about women in Hinduism or women in Buddhism, because I do want to, review from last week because we did only get to meet one day. But then there's a lot to compare and contrast. Oh my God, there's coffee everywhere. Okay, so I will be right back. Thank you. And yes, feel free to unmute yourselves and just have an informal conversation or just post questions in the chat and I'll just be back in a quick. Okay, sort of feel like I'm tempting fate by putting on a white shirt, but we're good. Thank you. Okay, do you think it will ever change how women are treated, Celia? Oh, that's such a great question. And unfortunately, if you're paying any attention to the world right now, you know that things can change, but that just means they can also change for the worse. So we have made great strides, but unfortunately, in the last couple decades, we've taken a number of steps back. Systemic, just explicit, obvious, anti-woman, anti-female, anti-anyone who's not a straight white man, Christian, right? Like that epitome of white masculinity. So again, things can change. But again, without, I don't know, we got to get more organized or something. I don't know. I was just feeling discouraged this morning because, at times like these, I'm sure those of you who have a conscience are feeling the same way. Like you just never feel like you're doing enough or there's always something else you should be doing. And I just feel like I'm at a loss for what that is other than, supporting groups that are doing the work. But sometimes it just doesn't feel like enough. Do we have some other questions that we want to share, or did we have a little chat while I was gone? The following exhibit some of the gender imbalance in Hindu traditions. And what are the following? Okay, so to recap, right, again, we are continuing with our introduction to major world religions, right? So we started off the class just getting an idea of what philosophy is, getting an idea of what it means to study religion, and then getting an idea of what it means to study it from something like a feminist perspective, right? In it, the many multiple, oh my God, do not cause trouble, Missy. The many different forms that it can take. And so we then looked at indigenous traditions, which are some of the oldest living traditions today, right? So we're going to see a lot of influence and historical sort of callbacks to those traditions. Even so, at the end of the term, when we circle back to new sort of what we might call neo or pagan traditions, pagan is just a word for anything that predates Christianity, right? And so what we're going to be seeing at the end of the class is sort of a hearkening back to those old traditions. But now we're going chronologically, right? So in our major world religions, we started off with Hinduism because according to that tradition, excuse me, it doesn't have like a date of origin like other major institutionalized religions do. And so in that sense, I'm considering it the oldest and that it considers itself to be eternal, right? Other religious traditions are going to have not only a starting origin date or time period, but also a historical figure or set of figures who are going to be at the foundation of those traditions, like we're going to see in Buddhism. But Hinduism is different in that respect. So in a lot of ways, it has similarities to indigenous traditions, right? The word Hindu doesn't actually tell us what it means to be a Hindu because it just refers to the Sindhu River in India, right? And so that we get that sort of geographical location as a sort of core identity that we saw in indigenous traditions, right? So what the basic idea is that in Hinduism, as this very, very ancient religious tradition, you can't really classify it as one thing, right? So you're going to see elements of polytheism, you're going to see elements of monotheism, you're going to see elements of pantheism, right? Where God is sort of inhabiting certain elements of life. Yeah, and so all of these complex metaphysics are going to have implications for our view of ourselves and the role that we play in the world. And so I wanted to reshare with you some of the resources that I have on my website. So starting off with the Hinduism page, this is where you can find an overview of that metaphysical picture. And the important thing to highlight, and you can see Hinduism and Buddhism there under the Indian metaphysics. I'm actually going to maybe share my screen with you so that you can follow along. That would be this image right here. And so again, on the left-hand side, you have Hinduism and Buddhism. And so the idea is that if we sort of draw an invisible line down the middle, right, the things that are on this side are going to be terms that specifically refer to the Hindu metaphysical philosophy. And again, these are going to have implications on their view of the self and thus implications for gender. And so we talked about that last week in the context of the caste system. One of the defining features of Buddhism as an offshoot of Hinduism, one of the many schools that eventually formed out of it, is going to be the ways in which the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, rejected certain aspects of Hinduism. And one of the primary things that he disagreed with was the caste system, right? So we're going to see some significant variation in the metaphysics in Buddhism, which will again have implications for the view of the self and thus the view of gender. Right, so make sure to look at that, especially for terminology, right? Because sometimes we have terms that mean similar things, but again, depending on which religion we're talking about, it could mean very different things, right? So for example, we will define two words or many words as enlightenment. Does anyone know what we call enlightenment in Hinduism? What the Sanskrit word is?
I think it's like M-O-K-S-A.
Very good. Yes, it's pronounced moksha, right? And so moksha, yes, it means enlightenment, but it means a very specific idea of enlightenment, specifically that your Atman, your true self, has rid itself of the illusion of Maya, right? It has discovered that the physical world is not the most real thing, and that all of these ways in which we differentiate ourselves from each other and all these categories are part of the illusion of Maya. And so once you overcome that ignorance and you recognize your true self is one with Brahman, the ultimate reality, right? The idea is that you no longer then are reincarnated in the cycle of samsara, right? That cycle of death and rebirth. And again, the goal is to eventually escape that cycle. But what's interesting in Buddhism, again, is we have a word for enlightenment, and it's going to mean something similar but also different, because the similarity is going to be, yes, we want to be released from samsara, but is there a Brahman or Atman in Buddhism? Is there an ultimate reality in Buddhism, a true self in Buddhism, something like a soul, an immortal soul? So good, Sierra, the word for enlightenment in Buddhism is nirvana, right? So we have nirvana in Buddhism, moksha in Hinduism. But does nirvana also include something like a Brahman or an Atman, like we saw in Hinduism? Metaphysical chart here, right? Brahman is up here, Atman is up here. Do we have that on the Buddhism side? Cats around. Sip of coffee. Very good, Summer. Summer says, I don't believe Buddhists believe in an eternal soul. They do believe in anatta, though. Very good. Okay, so this is the sort of complex, somewhat similar, somewhat different notion in Buddhism. So they accept the bottom part of that metaphysical picture, right? Everything about Maya, right? Samsara, karma, reincarnation, all of that stuff. But what they disagree with, and this is directly a result of Siddhartha Gautama's personal experience, right? So in this respect, when we talk about Buddhist epistemology, right, theories of knowledge, we can consider it a sort of empirical epistemology, right? Very much the idea that knowledge only comes from experience. Okay, and so this is why Siddhartha Gautama himself did not discuss the afterlife, right? He didn't discuss things that he himself did not experience. And so when he engages in the type of meditative practice that eventually leads him to nirvana or enlightenment, he's doing this sort of inward look, which is what Hinduism advocates for, right? Looking inward and then recognizing that your true self is Atman. But when he looked inward, he actually discovered something else, anatta, which means not self. But notice that this is not the same as saying there is no self, because surely there's stuff there. But the point that he's making is that anything that he recognized in what he considered or called himself, none of that was permanent. He only identified or experienced temporary things. And so that's the other bit of that metaphysical picture, right? What are called the 5 skandhas. Those are the 5 elements. If you're curious, you can look those up, what they are, that make up, but it's sort of equivalent to the 5 senses and then how that leads up to consciousness. But according to Buddhism, all of that, because it stems from our sense experience, all of that goes away when the physical body goes away. So even if you think that's a cool idea, we still have to sort of answer this question then, what is getting reincarnated? Right? If there is no immortal soul, if all of the skandhas disintegrate upon physical death, then how is reincarnation in samsara working? And Buddhism has an interesting answer for that. Similar to Hinduism, Hinduism has a motor for samsara. Who can remember what drives samsara? What's going to determine what you're reborn as, or what realm you're reborn in the next life? What's that law of cosmic justice?
Dharma and karma.
Karma, very good. Dharma in particular in Hinduism is your duty, right? So, and in Hinduism, your duty is going to be determined by your karma, and that determines what caste you're born into, right? And then what function or duty or dharma you have to serve in order to work towards enlightenment. So now I saw a question earlier about dowry deaths from Celia. I never knew about dowry deaths and the different words to describe the different caste systems. Is this the same as we kind of have low and upper middle class? Yes, definitely. I would say even more so. I think we have closer to 4 castes even than 3, especially when you consider like the most elite, like top 1% type of class. I think we also tend to separate US society and socioeconomic class. We use colors. So we say white collar jobs or blue collar jobs, or now there are pink collar jobs, right? To reference those occupations that have historically been, women have been allowed to work for, right? And so, yeah, other countries absolutely have variations of caste systems. A lot of people will argue that, they're all just variations of the same sort of class system. Does that answer your question? If there was a question. Yes, Celia? Awesome, great. Okay, so karma then is going to be the vehicle still in Buddhism for reincarnation. Then we have a question of how is that fair, right? Because in Hinduism, you're paying the karmic consequences of your soul's previous choices, right? But in Buddhism, if there is no continuation, right, there is nothing in this physical body that accumulated the karma that you are now suffering, right? Then why is it just, right? Why is a law of justice or fairness for you to have to suffer? And it wasn't your choices. And so this is, again, sort of where Buddhism rests on the fact that it takes almost a sort of release of that sort of obligation or pressure to put meaning on things like that, because all of those attempts are also inside of Maya, right? You're trying to make the illusion make sense. And the only thing that we can observe about this illusory world, and this is again based on empirical epistemology, is something like what we call cause and effect, right? They have a much more elaborate way of describing it. They call it the doctrine of dependent arising, right? Everything that comes into existence, right, while it exists, undergoes change and eventually goes out of existence. And that again is true of us and is true of all of the suffering or injustices that we are trying to explain away or make right. And so they have, this is something that we're going to start to see, especially as Buddhism migrates over into China and we start to uncover Chinese philosophical traditions, which are much more narrative. And so they're going to be telling stories. And sometimes these stories involve animals. So the Buddha's story that is meant to sort of, I guess you could call it an allegory, that is meant to represent this idea is that there are two monkeys. And one of these monkeys is throwing coconuts, right? He's just standing on the beach, throwing coconuts, throwing coconuts, throwing coconuts. And this other monkey is walking by and starts getting hit by the coconuts. And he's like, dude, what are you doing? Why are you throwing coconuts at me? He's like, I'm just throwing coconuts. You don't have to stand there, right? And so this is supposed to be an allegory for karma. Can anyone figure out which monkey represents karma? The one throwing the coconuts or the one being hit by the coconuts? Throwing, very good, Ryan. Okay, so the monkey throwing the coconuts is karma, right? That's all the stuff that you have to deal with that is really not your responsibility. And that is sort of a reality of the world that we find ourselves in, right? We are stuck dealing with the consequences of every single person that came before us. I mean, look at the world right now. It couldn't be a better example of that, right? And so, yeah, we could stand there and complain about being hit in the head with the coconuts, or as someone was just asking earlier, can we do something about it? Can it change? And according to Buddhism, yes, it absolutely can, right? And so, but you are in control of your contribution to that situation and nothing else. And again, your notion of your is not going to be possessive and like, I am doing the right thing, but recognizing that you are at least in a physical body and can control how it moves and how it interacts with the things around you, right? And so there are some funny, Buddhist jokes about this, like, how does a Buddhist say they're hungry? They say like, there is hunger here or something like this, right? You can recognize physical sensations and things that are happening within what you think of as yourself without taking ownership of it or making it part of your identity, right? And again, this is meant to be something that helps us to achieve nirvana. So what is nirvana then? If we're being released from Maya, right? We're no longer suffering from our karmic effects, right? What does that mean? We're not being reabsorbed into Brahman. So what is nirvana in Buddhism?
Nirvana is more like for yourself an internal enlightenment compared to moksha, which is for like everybody. That's how I kind of see it.
Interesting. So I think you're tapping into a very particular view of nirvana, which I think is probably the most successful, like philosophically coherent version, which is the idea that nirvana is not a permanent place, right? It is a state of mind, a way of being, right? Which allows you to escape the thing that sucks about samsara, which is the suffering, right? Samsara is always suffering in both Hinduism and Buddhism. That's why we want to get out of it, right? That's the whole point. And the reason that we suffer in samsara is because we are constantly attaching ourselves to temporary things. And because we attach ourselves to them, we are inevitably in pain once they leave us, right? Because again, everything is temporary, nothing is permanent. And so all of the things that we desire to have permanence end up going away. And so Buddhism is just adding one more thing to that picture and saying there's another thing that you're attached to that's causing you suffering, and that is your sense of you. And again, there might be a really applicable, way of living if one were to adopt such a view, right? We're at a time where, I think everyone has to make a choice of how much they're just going to look out for, themselves or how much they're going to try to do what is right for the larger group, right? The larger whole. And so in Buddhism, right, a very common idea is that you are supposed to not be contributing anymore to suffering. Now, the question of whether or not that's available to everyone, that's where some schools of Buddhism differ. Some traditions are going to say all the individual can do is like remove themselves from society, right? And so that's where you have the monk that, retreats up to the mountains and lives in a life of isolation and deep contemplative thought outside of society. The much more common view, the one that is much more in line with how Siddhartha Gautama lived his life, is to participate in a sangha, a community of practitioners. And the idea is that when you are part of that group, you are intentionally postponing your nirvana so that you can help other people achieve it too, right? So it's considered like a very selfless way of achieving nirvana. And so the particular enlightened person in the communal sense is called a bodhisattva, right? This is someone who has achieved, can achieve nirvana whenever they want, but they are sticking around in this physical world so that they can help other people achieve enlightenment as well. So again, different branches that are going to have different things, but the thing that's going to be most important for us, again, is how do these philosophies, these metaphysics especially, but also the epistemologies, how do they align with views of gender and identity, right? So the issue in Hinduism is, well, on the one hand, we're separating everybody into castes, right, based on their gunas and their soul and their karmic, points or whatever. And the result was that if you are born in a female body, that is already a sign that you have accumulated bad karma in the past. And of course, that seems to be inherently at odds with the notion that our true self, our Atman, is universal, right? It's something that we all share. So why is my Atman better or worse than yours just because it happens to be in a female body in this life, right? So we have an inconsistency there. Similarly, we're going to see in Buddhism. In practice, there's going to be a lot of misogyny, right? A lot of patriarchal practices, especially after the Buddha's death, but he had some interesting conversations about women joining the religion, which we should talk about. But the idea is that it became especially sort of marginalized and separated after his death once they started to institutionalize more and started making it so that women were not seen as being capable of achieving nirvana as easily or as quickly as men. And it was a direct result of the fact that they were in physical or female bodies, right? So because of the historical association of femininity with sex and the body, and masculinity with the mind and rationality, the fact that a female or that you were a female meant that it was going to be harder for you to detach yourself, right? We just associate women with their bodies more. And so if the goal is to detach from our physical self, that is, they thought, of course, going to be then harder for women to do. And so, right, we can see how this then, again, we have another sort of inconsistency. And so what I think is a helpful way of understanding not self is to think of the things that make up your sense of self are empty. And I'm putting empty in quotes here too. So emptiness in Buddhism means like empty of permanence, right? So it can mean whatever the fuck you want it to mean. So it's not empty of meaning, but the idea is that that meaning is not determined by some abstract reality, right? Or objective truth. It is empty, it's only temporary. So there's an impetus to be very much in the present, right? Which again, can actually have some potentially beneficial mental health benefits, which is why we see a lot of science now involving self-help and mental health using Buddhist meditative practices, right? I don't think it's an accident at all, because the goal, again, is to overcome the suffering via our attachment to things that are temporary. Okay, so I've been talking for a little while. Again, I did mention that I want to talk about what the Buddha said about women, but I want to pause. Questions, comments about what we've discussed so far, just with the inconsistency of these metaphysics and then the view of women and their status. Giving everyone time to think. It's a lot to chew on. Oh my God. You didn't get it. You weren't fast enough. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. And we're just going to go through really quickly these basic concepts of Buddhism again, what it should imply with regards to gender, but then how it has sometimes manifested in practice. And then in the PowerPoint for this week, you can see also how it's been in practice in the various schools. Because again, like Hinduism, Buddhism has been around for a long time. Buddhism has also, I think, had more, let's say, exportation and not appropriation. Exportation around the world, sometimes appropriation. But so it's taken on a lot of different forms and a lot of different variations. But what's interesting is that this association between of women and their bodies and sex ends up being a really important point of contention, because it is the source of historically women's denigration, right? Associating with sin, right? Things that are unclean, associating menstruation, as we saw with indigenous, right? With lack of cleanliness, right? And then there, on the other hand, is where we're going to see a little bit in the later schools of Buddhism, and especially we're going to start seeing in Taoism, which is, again, the sort of acknowledgement that the indigenous traditions made, which is there is a power in women's sexuality. And perhaps that power can be a pathway to enlightenment, one that Hinduism didn't acknowledge, although the Kama Sutra is actually one of the many paths, right? Sutra is a set of texts. So there, right, the idea is that you can even engage in sexual activity and not be tied to the fruits of one's labor. Probably easier said than done if you are not a biological female. You're literally tied to the fruits. But the idea here is that if we're going to try to move beyond ourselves and this physical body that we're trapped in, well, then again, we need to acknowledge that we are more than just masculine or feminine. And so the idea was that through heterosexual intercourse, right, the masculine and feminine energy could come together and, right, help those individuals achieve enlightenment. But then again, that just ends up being used to exploit women, right? You get these male religious leaders in these like guru yogi positions of power, right? And all of the women have to have sex with him in order to, right? It's a little convenient for the patriarchy. And so again, there's this one pivotal connection here of women and their bodies and sex, and it being used for the negative, but also potentially the source for the positive. Okay, so this is the PowerPoint on women in Buddhism, right? So definitely look at some, at least my gig pages for Buddhism before you dive into this, right? So this is that doctrine of dependent arising I was talking about. You can also think of it like that saying, you know, you never step into the same river twice, or you can't step into the same river twice, because if you put your toe in 1 second, when you put it in, when you remove it and put it in again, it's different water. This, you know, all the soil underneath has been moved, right? That sort of idea. Everything is constantly changing, including, again, in Buddhism, ourselves, every part of ourselves, right? And so those are the 3 marks of existence, which again, you can see on my website. There's also a much more in-depth PowerPoint for introduction to Buddhism. Then the idea is how to achieve knowledge, which again is going to be very much based on empirical experience and only, right, attributing any truths to things that we can learn from that experience. But again, our experiences are also not permanent. So even knowledge in Buddhism is not going to be permanent, right? It's something that we should be always striving for, always learning. And so in that sense, you have a path that one could potentially follow. It's seen as the middle way historically, because Siddhartha Gautama, if you look at the content about the beginnings of his life, he was actually very wealthy. And so it ends up seeming sort of interesting that he himself would be advocating against a caste system, because he very much grew up benefiting from that. But he had this remarkable experience where he encountered all of the things that he had been kept from him, basically, old age, sickness, and especially death, right? And so realizing that no amount of money in the world could keep him from dying really made him recognize that all of the wealth and privilege that he had been granted was just for naught, right? Again, you're just attaching to something that is eventually going to go away. And so he then pursued the various paths in Hinduism, because that was the dominant religion in the time. And that involved going to the other extreme, right? So he started on one extreme of extreme wealth, and then he engaged in what was called, I'm gonna come back to the Zoom. Can I do that here? Asceticism, which is a life of denial. So if you see anyone who takes like a vow of poverty, who is unhoused by choice, right, and who only consumes the bare minimum of food and water to survive, that is an ascetic lifestyle, right? You are intentionally denying yourself extreme types of pleasure in order to detach yourself from this body, right? Sort of to like deprogram it from always wanting those pleasures satisfied. Okay, so he tried both. He tried, restart my screen share. There we go. Okay, so he tried both, and so he ended up passing out under a tree and having an intense hallucination, followed by his meditative path to enlightenment under a Bodhi tree. And that is then considered the middle way, right? So you don't have to, deny yourself, but you also shouldn't be overly indulgent. And so that's going to be the sort of ethical guideline. But again, right, how does that all play out for women? Right, so we have these philosophies, and when Siddhartha Gautama was returning home and starting to share, right, the things that he had learned, it was primarily women who followed him. His wife, he had previously left behind, he had left a wife and child when he went off to practice Hinduism and achieve enlightenment. And when the women asked to join, they were denied 3 times. Anyone know why Siddhartha Gautama denied the women joining him when he was starting to create his sangha, his community of practitioners? Oh, Celia, good question. Fasting is definitely a form of that, right? And then, although fasting in Abrahamic religions, we're going to see, is more about feeling appreciation for what God has given you, right? By experiencing empathy with those who have less. So it's a little different, but appreciation versus detachment. What did Siddhartha say would happen if women joined Buddhism? All right, I'll give you a hint. He made a prediction about how long the religion would last. Okay, so he is going to say that it's either going to last longer if women join or not as long. What was his prediction? Shorter, that's right. So Siddhartha Gautama, right, in all of the ways that his philosophies would seemingly advocate and imply that women can achieve enlightenment, and later in his life, he very much surrounded himself with individuals, women, who he treated as capable of enlightenment. He started off by denying their being able to join because he predicted that if they did, the religion wouldn't last as long. Now, it's already lasted far longer than his even generous prediction, but he said it would last about half as long if women joined. So there are a couple of ways that, historians have interpreted this, that maybe he wasn't, being biased and against them, but just sort of being practical, like, recognizing the levels of misogyny in the world. But eventually, someone asked him, after the women asked him, a male student asked, right? And they sort of walked through the logic, and then he said yes. But it's interesting and potentially problematic that they had to try so hard in order to join, given that they were his most devoted followers from the very beginning, and a lot of them were also his family members. So a bit concerning there, right? And then, of course, this only got worse after his death, as I mentioned, when these religious traditions, they sort of broke apart into some major schools of thought that have since, broken off into many, many, many schools. But the big difference there was whether or not to follow the life of the Buddha or the writings that had been done based on his teachings. And so one tradition went with the former and the other went with the latter. And they ended up having, different sorts of specific ideas about what women were capable of. Pretty much all of them had the idea that women would, again, have to work harder or overcome more in order to achieve enlightenment. And even if they thought they had the same spiritual potential, right? Everyone was capable of achieving nirvana, if that's what's up here, right? The idea was that women were starting down here, right? Well, if you were born in a male body, you were already starting up here. And that becomes the most obvious once we go through the different branches and we get down to Chan Buddhism, which is, so there's Mahayana, Theravada, Vajrayana. Out of the Vajrayana is what comes Chan, Pure Land, and the Zen tradition, which is what we're most familiar with in the West. So you'll probably be interested in that. But the Pure Land Buddhism is just fascinating because it maintained that the only way to achieve in this particular branch of nirvana, the goal is not to just be released from samsara, but is actually meant you're actually trying to be reborn in the Pure Land. So it's one of the only sort of versions of Buddhism where there is a specific afterlife you're trying to get to. And the only way to achieve access to the Pure Land, if you are currently in a female body, is to renounce one's female form. Okay, so you can't be reborn in the Pure Land as a female, right? So it's really difficult to square details like this with the notion that everybody has the same spiritual equality, right? There still seems to be this constant denigration of the female form, and it tends to be based, again, historically on its association with sexuality. All right, so we have about 5 minutes left. I want to allow for questions. I know that was a lot of information, so make sure to use those graphs, make sure to go through the PowerPoints. You can see they had extra rules they had to follow. You're going to see why it's so hard to have the same number of Buddhist nuns as there are monks, because the rituals that are required are just going to be like logistically difficult if you don't have women. So there's just a lot of misogyny still prevalent, right? Even if the philosophies itself should imply some sort of egalitarianism. Okay, questions, thoughts? Should we take a look at some of these rules together? Okay. All right, so on the right here, you can see general, I mean, there are hundreds of rules that monks and nuns have to follow, but right, the idea is that there are a bunch that they all have to follow, and just living in part of the sangha, right, and devoting oneself to a life of detachment. Okay, but then there are special rules just for nuns. So the first one, nuns must rise and salute to monks. Nuns must retreat without monks. So when you're retreating away for periods of solitude, right, or deep meditation, right? The idea is that we now have gender segregation that is being instituted in those situations. Nuns must request counsel from a monk every week, but you'll note that monks are not ever required to request counsel from nuns, let alone every week. Nuns must seek forgiveness of offenses from both monks and nuns, but you'll notice that monks are not required to seek forgiveness for offenses against nuns. I wonder if they're required to seek forgiveness of offenses against other monks. I should probably look that up. Major offenses must be dealt with by both if you're a nun, right? So again, the implication being that if you're a monk, You don't have to have both parties involved in any sort of oversight, but if you're a nun, men must be present. Females can only be ordained, again, brought into the order with both. Again, so if we already don't have a lot of nuns, it's going to make it even harder to do the rituals and to ceremonies to bring in more. And then, of course, this is great, nuns may never criticize or abuse monks. But again, we do not have such a rule for monks. And nuns may never counsel monks. So even if a monk was, enlightened enough to try to seek counsel from a nun, they're not allowed to provide counsel, right? So again, what are we to think of these types of rules, given what the philosophies and the metaphysics say about who we are? When you say that Pure Land Buddhists had to renounce their female body, how would they identify and live after that? That's a good question. So contemporary Pure Land Buddhism is trying to distance themselves from this. So you'll see in depictions of the Pure Land, in newer depictions, you might see some females, but in older depictions, everybody's male. So typically the Pure Land is depicted with the triple Buddha, which is one of those magic numbers of 3. We have the tripartite soul in Hinduism, and we have the Trimurti, right? The 3 main attributes of Brahman. Of course, people are familiar with the Holy Trinity in Christianity. Here we have another sort of 3. This is just 3 ways of talking about aspects of the Buddha. But so the triple Buddha represents the various commitments you make to the Buddhist lifestyle, right? One again being the sangha. But so all of those identities are masculine, and then all of the people reborn in the Pure Land, again, look up paintings. It's pretty much all going to be males, unless the painting is more recent. And I'm not sure whose body. I don't know. All right. Well, I believe I have someone hanging out after class potentially, but if they're not, then feel free to hang out and ask me any questions. Otherwise, I will see you all on Thursday. Great day.